These medications are life-changing for many individuals. We don't say people are renting blood pressure control, people are renting lipid control, people are renting diabetes control or whatever. So why the stigma and bias when it comes to obesity, weight loss, and so on?
You struck my nerve. It's the thing that like drives me crazy out there. And every time I see it, it's like, you're losing muscle. And honestly, it's killing me. Folks that are in the exercise world are interested in this space of obesity that maybe they don't quite understand. And that's why I really appreciate you all having us on for this conversation today, because it's so interesting that, so many patients, when I asked them about exercise and they're taking these medications, first thing they said is, I'm freaking out. I'm freaking out, Renee, because everybody's telling me I'm losing muscle.
You get worked up because you care, right? And it's the passion about, obviously, the topic. We could be closing the door to the use of, an enormously successful therapy through fear.
The Exercise Science Podcast, trained to improve your health and fitness.
Welcome to the Exercise Science Podcast. We're your hosts, Martin Gabala and Stuart Phillips. The Exercise Science Podcast is made to translate exercise science for the rest of the world.
Marty is the worldwide expert on time-efficient cardio.
And Stu is the global expert on strength, muscle development, and protein.
Hard facts, no hype.
Remember, we're on most platforms at Real Exercise Science. Give us a follow or a subscribe.
So today we're talking about a new class of weight loss drugs known as Semaglutide, tirzepatide, or better known such as brand names like Ozempic, Wegovy, Mounjaro, and Zepbound. One of the biggest anxieties that people have with these drugs is that they cause not just fat loss or weight loss, but also the loss of muscle mass.
So in this episode, we're going to discuss the latest findings on how GLP-1s affect muscle mass. We'll talk about the differences between lean mass and muscle mass. We'll introduce Dr. Rogers, Dr. Jakicic's clinical trial into GLP-1s, weight loss, muscle mass, and exercise. We'll say how concerned we think people should be about GLP-1s and muscle mass. And we're going to finish with some pointers about how to maintain muscle mass while on GLP-1s.
But first, let's take a quick ad break. Health information online is messy. Even the good stuff goes stale as science evolves. Consensus shifts, and what was solid 2 years ago may already be revised.
So what Everme built? A system that reads through filtered, vetted, published research papers and scores them for credibility before anything reaches you. They've actually filed patents for this technology.
On the app, you share your health goals, and you can also sync your wearables so it knows what your body is saying and what you're curious about. Every morning, you get a personalized health snapshot with an actionable intelligence. You can then link to the AI that learns and evolves with you, or learn more about longevity through dynamic podcasts or curated topics broken down into consumable formats.
Everme combines evidence-based research, advanced AI technology, and thoughtful design to support better everyday decisions related to long-term health and well-being. Learn more at everme.ai.
As a scientist, my job involves translating scientific research into clear directions for lay people, and the same is true of our supporters at Precision Nutrition. That's because Precision Nutrition is the world leader in research-driven coaching and certification. For 20 years, they've coached everyone from regular people to world-class athletes, including 6 world champions and Olympians. Precision Nutrition is where coaches earn the industry's top credentials and learn to coach people on GLP-1s. They also offer health and weight loss coaching, specializing in GLP-1s for regular folks to amp up their health behaviors with personalized research-backed guidance. Whether you want certification as a master health coach or to get in the best shape of your life, Precision Nutrition is the #1 most recommended nutrition certification program in the world and now specializes in GLP-1 coaching. Their website even offers free assessment to determine your GLP-1 type. Learn more at glpcoaching.com. Okay, let's start the show. We're here today with Dr. Renee Rogers, Dr. John Jakicic. How are you both doing?
Great. How are you?
Awesome. Fantastic. So you're both at Kansas University. That's in what part of Kansas? Remind me again.
Kansas City. We're in Kansas City.
Kansas City, Kansas. So not that other place, because somebody tells me they're from Manhattan, Kansas, and that's what's that? That's Kansas. That's the other.
That's
talk about them.
Yeah.
That's Kansas State.
Oh,
that's the other guys. They're the purple guys. We're the blue and red guys.
You're the Jayhawks. You're the legendary basketball school, right? I got that?
That's
That's
right.
correct.
We're at the medical
Excellent.
center though in Kansas City, so we're not quite in Lawrence where all the magic happens with the basketball. We're
Okay,
Kansas
see?
City side, yeah.
You know, so I have to get down to Kansas one time. Probably that's a famous line, as somebody said. But so just to give you, a quick background, Dr. Renee Rogers is senior scientist at the University of Kansas Medical School studying biobehavioral interventions for obesity treatment. She's also a fellow of the American College of Sports Medicine and chair of the ACSM's Strategic Health Initiative for Behavior and chair of ACSM's International Health and Fitness Summit. She has a PhD in exercise physiology from the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. John Jakicic is a professor in the Department of Internal Medicine in the Division of Physical Activity and Weight Management at the University of Kansas in Kansas City. He studies obesity and body weight regulation and their relationship to chronic disease with a history of research to determine the appropriate dose of physical activity for long-term body weight regulation. He's also president-elect of the ACSM and obtained a PhD in exercise physiology from the University of Pittsburgh. So thank you both for being on the show. It's an honor and a pleasure, and we're excited to talk to you about your clinical trial. But I wonder if first we can give our audience some context. So we're in this sort of, I think it would be fair to say, unprecedented situation. We actually have weight loss drugs that work, and that must be, an amazing scenario for clinicians. And they're incredibly popular. And I think I don't know what the current estimates are. They keep going up every day, but about sort of 12 to 16% of US adults, roughly 30 to 40 million people, use GLP-1 medications like semaglutide, tirzepatide for weight loss. Millions more take these drugs under the brand names that we've discussed. And some of these studies regarding these drugs have come down the pipeline showing that they can be incredibly effective. I think some phase 3 data just got released last week, if I'm not mistaken, from a new drug that Lilly's got going on, retatrutide, or it's retatrutide, I'm never really sure, that's talking about 30% weight loss, which is, it's just mind-blowing. So, clearly these things are hot. There's, I don't know how many in development and how many in phase 2, 3 clinical trials. And I'm sure you're both aware that here in Canada, semaglutide at least has lost its patent protection. So, Canada will be one of the first countries in the G7 to get generic forms of Ozempic and maybe in the future Wegovy as well. So let's talk a little bit about how these drugs, affect. Is it appetite, gastrointestinal, motility, and how they might work? And some have reportedly, and this is the sort of the pivotal conversation, given us muscle loss or lean mass loss at least. And is that a cause for concern? And really, where do we start on this? And maybe John, I'll start with you, and then Renee will come to you and give me your Cliff's Note versions on these drugs and what you think.
Yeah, I'll jump in, and Renee has really kind of dug in deep in terms of some of the mechanistic things. She's really on top of it, so I'll say a little bit of that for her. But I think you were hitting on the big pieces of it, Stu, in that these medications really are affecting appetite and satiety signaling through a variety of different mechanisms. As we now know, these medications were really initially not for weight loss and obesity treatment. They really were for diabetes treatment and have evolved down the pipe, as other medications have for the treatment of obesity over the years. These do slow down gastric emptying and things that can contribute to all of this. And I think that these are game changers. These are life-changing medications for individuals living with obesity. And I think that in our space, this exercise science space, I think the one thing that we all should be very, very, aware of is obesity is a very complex endocrine disease. And it's not about willpower. It's not about, not being able to control what you eat. There are a lot of drivers of this. And just like any other medication out there for any other chronic medical condition, these medications that we're talking about are going after the mechanisms by which individuals develop obesity and have to live with this condition of obesity. And so I think that, we're in a really interesting space right now. But the one thing and you're hitting on the lean tissue and the muscle, and I know we're going to get to that, and I'll let Renee talk a little bit more about the mechanisms. But I want to go right out front and say, there have been some recent comments about, well, these medications are just renting weight loss. And I don't think that that's an appropriate statement. These medications are not renting weight loss. These medications that we're talking about are treating the condition of obesity. And I think that we need to think about this as a chronic condition. These medications are really going to be life-changing for many individuals living with that chronic disease. But Renee, you may want to jump in and talk a little bit more about some of the mechanisms.
Sure, absolutely. And, I always look every morning, 162 agents are in the research and development pipeline. So, and many of these, may have the GLP-1 backbone. And I think everybody likes to call these GLP-1s, right? GLP-1. Spoiler alert, we're looking at a lot of incretins or nutrient stimulated hormones is the way we like to think about them. So we are looking at not just GLP-1, but we're looking at glucagon. We have GIP in the mix. Amylin is a big player coming down the pike we want to be watching for. And different combinations of these medications are out there. It's fascinating. Right now, we talk about them as being receptor agonists, right? They're turning on the receptors for these hormones. They're mimetics. They mimic the hormones. They're not actually putting the hormone in your body. And when that happens, right, in the body, we're talking about turning on the receptor, which is what is actually helping in the brain, primarily hypothalamus, that area of the brain that controls our hunger and satiety. And it is actually impacting patients in many ways. It's making them feel fuller sooner. So when they eat something, they notice that they eat maybe half as much and they're full already, which again, for all of us, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? In the presence of it all. And when we get down to the crux of it, when it comes to the reason why individuals that are living with excess body weight or adiposity have this, it's because it's that neuroendocrine signaling from the adipose tissue. We like to call it adipose tissue dysfunction. So when you've been carrying adipose tissue for a period of time, and unfortunately, we don't have all the answers as to when, why, how, where it changes, when it changes, what all those things are. But what we do know is that tissue can become dysregulated. That's what causes this food noise. And these medications are suddenly doing a wonderful job at helping to turn the volume down on some of that food noise. And that's what's really helping to control hunger, appetite, and overall the volume or amount of food that people may be taking in.
So could we discuss body composition a little bit, how it changes through that weight loss? And, something known as the Forbes rule that suggests weight loss consists of roughly 3/4 fat, 1/4 lean mass. And so could we discuss the difference, first of all, I guess, between lean mass and muscle mass? And then I'm also curious, is that rule of thumb sort of holding broadly for these medications? If people have massive weight loss in different ways. So could you just talk us through that a little bit, please?
Yeah, I'll jump in and start. So I think as you all have known, we've been doing work in the body composition, obesity, weight loss space for 30-ish years. We started with, traditional lifestyle, behavioral weight loss programs. We've done a lot of work in very low calorie or very low energy diets, 500 to 800 calories a day. And we've also done work prior to this work in metabolic and bariatric surgery. Across the board, we have seen somewhere between a 15 and 25% reduction in lean tissue, fat-free mass, with about 75% obviously coming then from adipose tissue, 75 to 85% coming from adipose tissue. And so, as we've started to look at these medications, some of the early studies, the data are probably getting a little bit better at this point. But the early studies were suggesting that the medications, the semaglutide, tirzepatide, were reducing lean tissue weight by about 25 to 40%. Those were estimates. Some of those were using bioelectrical impedance. Some of them were using DEXA, different, bod pod, these kinds of things. So, the bigger the weight loss you get, probably the greater the reduction, the greater the less loss of fat mass and the greater reduction of lean tissue you have. It's just probably a bigger delta that you're seeing in many ways. So with the medications that we're looking at, we're seeing, in that same area of weight loss. In a pilot study we've done leading up to our R01, in about 10 people, we have actually seen that the reduction in lean tissue from DEXA is about 25%. And so and these are patients that are on either one of those medications. But that's lean tissue. That is not muscle tissue. And Renee and I have been talking. We put the first paper out along with our colleague Tim Church that discussed this issue, that lean tissue is not muscle. Lean tissue can be organ weight, connective tissue weight. I mean, Stu, you know more about this stuff than I'll ever know in terms of what we're talking about here. But then the question becomes: is that a dysfunctional loss? Is that more than what we would expect? Is that an adaptive response? Is this harmful to people? I think we have a lot of unanswered questions when it comes to this, but I think, Renee and I have been out on the tour talking about this. You cannot say that all this weight is muscle mass. We don't know that, and we actually probably don't believe that it all actually is from the data that we have. So we have to be very careful about terminology here for sure.
Yeah. And you kind of it's my nerve. You struck my nerve. It's the thing that drives me crazy out there. And every time I see it, it's you're losing muscle. And honestly, it's killing me, right? When I watch people, say this over and over again, because we actually did some qualitative work initially before we did our pilot study. Because a lot of, you described my work as being biobehavioral. And I really like to talk to patients directly as much as we possibly can to get real world perspective. And I think that's so important, especially as folks that are in the exercise world are interested in this space of obesity that maybe they don't quite understand. And that's why I really appreciate you all having us on for this conversation today, because it's so interesting that, so many patients, when I asked them about exercise, now that they're taking these medications, first thing they said is, I'm freaking out. I'm freaking out, Renee, because everybody's telling me I'm losing muscle. For the first time in my life, I have something that has lowered the volume on this food noise. I'm finally I feel like I'm in control. I'm seeing the scale move in a positive way. That's not extreme. It's maybe 1 to 2 pounds a week, but it's consistent and I'm able to stick with something. But now I'm being told I'm losing muscle. Am I losing muscle? Is that what I'm losing? So it's okay, pause, let's step back. And I think that's really important because, as you all know, it has spiraled in media messaging. We're seeing it in headlines. We're seeing on social media. The whole world's out there saying these things, and it's actually scaring patients. And one of the criticisms we hear about the medication often is that people don't stay on them. And what we know and what we see in the clinic a lot is part of that's because there's such a fear now related to this muscle issue that we don't even know is actually true. So you hear people talking about wanting to off-ramp or get off of a medication because they're worried about muscle mass loss, where in fact, this may be the most effective medication in its time to help control this neuroendocrine disease. So, Marty, you asked the question, muscle is not the same as lean tissue. We need to be very careful. And all this data was originally based off of the general efficacy studies that, like John mentioned, we're using DEXA, they're using BIA. Now, there are some sub-studies that have come out that are starting to look at MRI data and muscle data specifically. We're seeing those percentages seem to be a little bit lower. I think the 40% was the one that seems to be shifting back. Like John said, data is starting to look more in that range of 25%. And even some estimates are showing potentially a little bit lower. But what's been missing from the puzzle are the really good direct measures. And also, we don't have data surrounding the role of exercise yet.
You've nailed a couple of things that I hear a lot on and see a lot on social media. Muscle's having a moment. Clearly, people are sort of, it warms my heart to know that muscle is in the spotlight and people are concerned about it. Rightfully so. Is it a big deal? And the answer is that we simply don't know. But as you say, Renee, the fear mongering on social media is it's crazy. And so I think that, allaying those fears and just sort of doing some of the research and, that leads us perfectly into, one of the reasons why we've got you on the show, which is, you both have, and congratulations, highly successful R01. I know that that's no small achievement, particularly these days, maybe, going in this space. And so, clearly I'm not going to say, well, what are the results? But you've highlighted, I've heard you both speak about what it means for some of these people to come into a scenario and everybody goes, well, everybody needs to lift weights. And of course, preaching to the converted here, but it's not, you can't just snap your fingers and get these, and help, say, okay, everybody's lift weights. We know what to do. And then hope that everybody does it. So just, tell us maybe a little bit about the R01, what you're trying to do, and then maybe give us, a few sort of observations about some of the barriers that these people have faced when you bring them in and, try to adhere or comply with ACSM guidance or some organizational guidance on resistance training and preservation of muscle mass, not just lean mass.
Right. So the R01 is building off of a pilot that is ending and the R01 is kicking in. So we have this transition going on right now. So we actually have some things to say about some data on a small sample of individuals. And our R01 is actually kind of a pragmatic trial in many ways, where we're taking individuals who are being naturally prescribed any one of the FDA medications. It would have to be, at this point, semaglutide, tirzepatide. Pretty much is what we're going with. We have some latitude within the project to onboard any new medications that come on board that get FDA approved during the life of the trial. So we'll have some sense of how often that happens. It's a pretty simple design where we're actually randomizing individuals to standard of care. Take your medication, do what your doctor tells you without any of our help, or a supervised cardiovascular exercise program for a period of 6 months where they'll come into our lab 3 times a week, or a supervised resistance training program 3 times a week for a period of 6 months. We'd love to go longer. The funding doesn't allow for that, but we are already looking at how do we extend the study in some ways and do some interesting things. But, actually, Stu and Marty, I think you're both familiar with the MotorPack trial, which is the big exercise trial in the U.S. And that was a pretty heavy loaded exercise program for a period of 12 weeks. We've actually adopted that program saying, we're going to kind of give it the Cadillac of where, if we don't get a change with this, we're not going to get it. So it's not fluff, but we are, and I'll let Renee talk a little bit about some of the onboarding we're having to do and what we learned from the pilot that has really helped us. But I think it's really interesting in our pilot data. We can get into that in a few minutes. But Stu, it's interesting to me that we've always talked about weight training, weightlifting. And, we've actually been starting to pivot to resistance exercise. And that's a little bit different because one of the things that we're seeing when we put resistance on the body, even in a cardiovascular way, resistance on a bike, those kind of things, we're seeing improvements in lower body strength, even with a reduction in lean tissue. So I think we need to reframe it and think about how do we think about resistance activity as opposed to, kind of traditional weight training. And I think when we start to do that, that changes our discussion, that changes our opportunities with individuals who are on the medications. But I'll let Renee talk a little bit about, some of the nuances that we found in the pilot that are very, very interesting to us in terms of bringing people on board with this type of exercise.
It's such an interesting trial. And again, I'll go back to the early pilot, the qualitative work we did. When we first started talking to patients, again, we heard 2 main things. One, they were feeling weaker. And that's something that we need to pay attention to. And that's not surprising, right? We've seen that in bariatric surgery as well, post-bariatric surgery. Anytime there's a large magnitude weight loss, you can maybe expect some of that, right? And we're also talking about folks that are primarily sedentary. So us as exercise, scientists, exercise physiologists, people that do this work, it makes sense. The correlation's there. You're not moving, you're experiencing these things. We also had a lot of patients talking about fatigue. And that was an interesting question for us because we were wondering, is this fatigue related to physical activity? Is this fatigue related to the drug? Those are just questions that we just don't know right now, right? And to tease these different elements out. So I'm really excited with the clinical trial that we have the opportunity to add this cardiovascular arm into it as well, because a lot of patients do experience fatigue. And I think we know as when we think about real world application at the end of the day, as an exercise physiologist, when you write an exercise prescription, you're assessing the human in front of you and what they need. You're not necessarily saying, okay, you're on this med. We've never done this before, right? You're on this med, so you're going to do exactly this program. I think, Stu, to your earlier point, right? That's not the art of exercise physiology, right? But this trial is at least going to help us understand from the body composition perspective, but also from, we're looking at cardiorespiratory fitness. We're looking at, quad peak force. we're looking at grip strength. We're looking at functional outcomes across the board. And we're doing it in all three of these groups. And, in doing this in the pilot, it's been great because, as John mentioned, the motor pack protocol is quite aggressive in the sense of it is progressive resistance training. They only did it for 12 weeks. We're doing it for 6 months. So we spread the progression out a little bit more. The aerobic training, though, similarly, we're getting them up to 50 minutes of continuous training within the zone, plus or minus 70%. So we're really trying to, get them to a level. And for some folks coming in, as I mentioned, we're recruiting them because they are sedentary right now. We want to bring them in with that baseline. So when we're dealing with any human being, right, let's put obesity aside for a second, right? We're dealing with any human being. You got to ramp up. You got to progress. And again, going back to some of the earlier things we learned qualitatively is many patients were very nervous about entering a gym space. And when we talk about obesity, the biological stuff's what we started with, right? That's what we described. But we also have to recognize that this is a disease that has behavioral influences. And when I say behavioral, I don't just mean the things that people do or don't do. I mean truly things like weight bias and stigma, their relationships, the different things that are happening around them, and also environmental concepts. We know, right? The things you eat, the environment you have, the access to things that you have. So we love to say it's biological, behavioral, and environmental. So when we bring someone into a clinical trial like this, where we're trying to do something very rigid, we're bringing them into a gym, we have a stringent protocol, and you have someone that's had a negative experience with physical activity previously, or has had a poor experience at a gym, or they've been shamed or made fun of because of their body size. There's a lot coming into this, right? So we do have a lot of folks that, we really intro them in a positive way. We have to stop. We have to slow down. We have to make sure they feel comfortable. That's number one. But we also have many patients, right, that are living with obesity, that is not the only thing. It is not just about the body weight that they may be carrying or the excess adipose tissue. They also may have high blood pressure. They have low back pain. We've had patients with polycystic ovary syndrome, which is now our new name, PMOS, which is recently just changed. For the one gal, I can tell you, it was quite interesting. She was great, young girl, very excited. Medication was really working well for her. Unfortunately, the low back pain she was experiencing because of her condition state and the referred pain, even doing a leg press, was excruciating for her. We've had patients with high blood pressure that it wasn't in control enough. So again, all of us know you assess blood pressure, you make sure it's in a good state and place, right? There's lots of nuances that come into this that we didn't feel like it was correct or right to allow somebody with a blood pressure of 168/98 to come in and just start going through their resistance training program, right? So there's lots of things we have to remember. It's not always as simple as, hey, just start resistance training. There are reasons why we have to make sure that patients are ready mentally, physically, and also medically, that they're stable and ready. So we've had a lot of really great learnings across the board, related to all of this, and just reminders that this is a complex disease for many people. And it doesn't mean that's the case for everyone, but it does mean that, we have to pay special attention and almost not oversimplify what exercise prescription is and all the assets that go into it.
So Renee, maybe pick up on that point and really appreciate that you're taking this patient-informed or participant-informed lens on this research. So important, I think. Maybe mention the way that some people have seemingly, if I have it right, rediscovering a love for exercise while they're on these medications. There was a piece in the New York Times in which you were quoted. So are you seeing particular traits or things that are who is loving more exercise more than others while they're on these medications or finding this love?
Great question. I would love to have the perfect answer to that, right? So I haven't done the clinical trial yet, but I feel like it's the spread across the board, right? We are definitely seeing, some people, and I think this is what's really interesting about this relationship is, I say this all the time, is one, we should never assume that just because someone's living with excess body weight that they're not exercising. And I think that's a huge pet peeve of mine because honestly, prior to these medications, I can tell you, almost every patient will say, I've done every exercise program. I've followed every fad, trend. I've done it. Exercise, as we all know, is not the main driver of body weight loss. It's never been, right? It's not in the relationship. That's not, and unfortunately, it's been sold that way. And as we all know, exercise does so much more for your body than we would love to get away from that message, all of us, right? For decades, we've been saying that. So for a lot of patients, they've been doing it, unfortunately, because they've heard that that's what they should be doing. And then there's other patients that I just described that haven't been for some of those reasons. And the reality is once they do start to lose some body weight, we see that their function improves even without exercise, right? We've offloaded the body. They're able to move a little bit more freely. And with that being said, it opens the door for exercise. And I think that that's an amazing piece of this puzzle that is coming up. And that's what that New York Times article was about that you were mentioning. They interviewed quite a few people that said, because of these medications, I now can move better. And because I can move better, it's helped with my confidence. I'm not in as much pain. I'm able to get to the gym. I'm able to do these things. And so it's been progressive. So another reason why for me, I always pause when people say, I hear this a lot, is a medication shouldn't be prescribed unless someone's required to start exercising at the same time. And again, we want to be really careful sometimes with statements like that, because what if someone can't, right? What if someone's in so much pain and they don't have access to that qualified exercise professional initially, or coverage or the feasibility, and they don't know how to start, or they need to go, and oh my gosh, if they could lose, right, some weight, and now they reduce some of that pain, now the door opens up for them. We have to think about each individual trajectory, right? Now, yes, I want to make sure, and don't get me wrong, every person should have comprehensive care around that. That includes nutrition, that includes, exercise physiologists, all the things. But we have to be careful, right, in that relationship, because we could have this amazing thing happen for someone, but if we don't even give them access because they're not doing all of the things, and we saw some of this with metabolic bariatric surgery early on, which is why utilization may still be very low from a policy standpoint, we could be shutting a door on the opportunity for somebody to exercise. So we got to think of all sides of this crazy spectrum. Things are just moving really fast. So I think messages are getting really twisted quick.
You've unpacked so many things there. I think on social media too, there's a widespread assumption that everybody is like some motivated client that walks into a gym, has access to the means to have a personal trainer, et cetera, et cetera. So, thanks for, you've peeled back a lot of layers there and, discovered, I'd say unveiled for a lot of people, the human side of this, which is, something that I think gets, almost completely glossed over, at least on social media. So thank you so much for that. And John, your comment about renting weight loss. I recently returned from a conference where I asked a speaker who came from Denmark, from Copenhagen, very well known in the field, to react to that comment, because I saw it online, and the point was is people go off these drugs and we're just renting weight loss, and I thought it was a bit trite too. And I just said, react to this for me and tell me what your take on that is. And, is it the reality, or have we just, we've completely blown out of proportion the cessation of use of these drugs for lots of reasons. And, we are, as Renee said, we could be closing the door to the use of, an enormously successful therapy through fear. Maybe I could just get your quick reaction to that, because I saw the same video. I thought it was trite, but not. It was quite clever. It was a great soundbite, but clearly, you've had issues with that. Just maybe get a reaction to that from you.
Well, I was actually at the conference where that individual actually made the statement, and then I saw it on social media as a soundbite.
And most of all, people just don't stay on them. More than half of people aren't on them at 1 year, and only about a third are still on them at 2 years. And so to give these drugs where you get weight loss and then go off the drugs and regain the weight, we're not actually buying long-term health. We're just renting weight loss.
And at the conference, I was on a panel with this individual, and I just cringed up when I heard it. Because, Stu and Marty, these medications are life-changing for many individuals who have struggled with obesity. But when you look at the data for medication use across the board for chronic conditions, compliance can be 20 to 40% of people filling prescriptions, taking the medications, and so on. These medications, it's averaged that, it looks like maybe 60% of the people who are prescribed them are filling them and taking them as prescribed. So this is not any different, and actually it's better than what we see for a lot of other chronic health conditions. So we don't say people are renting blood pressure control, people are renting lipid control, people are renting diabetes control or whatever. So why the stigma and bias when it comes to obesity, weight loss, and so on? And I think that what's disheartening is some of the individuals who are saying these things are medical doctors. They're physicians. They're cardiologists. So when we give somebody a bypass for cardiology, but we don't do any wraparound care, and then, a few years later, they have to come back and get another bypass or another stent, did we not rent cardiovascular health for a period of time? But it's okay. In that sense, it's okay. And to me, as you can tell, I'm getting a little worked up about it. It's not fair. It's not right. It's not appropriate. And, and that's probably coming from the idea that when we talk about it, we're talking about weight loss. Obesity is not weight loss. Obesity is a chronic health condition. Weight is one component of that. And I think that we're being very short-sighted from a medical public health perspective if we make those kinds of statements. And so let's level the playing field and say obesity is like a lot of other chronic health conditions. Sometimes we need medical intervention for individuals to help them, and it's okay to do that. And if it's about overall health and well-being, let's call it what it is, and that's the way it goes. And there are three things that drive obesity in my mind: behavior, which we're talking about; environment, that I can't control where some fast food restaurant's going to put their restaurant. I can control how often I go to it and what I order when I go, but I can't control the environment in which I live. I can't control at the grocery store where people put, how they put food in the store. And one of the things I have very little control over is the physiology, the genetics, biology that, the good Lord gave me. and so I am, in a sphere of three components saying, all these things are drivers. And if my biology is a little bit not in line with managing my weight, sometimes I need some help, just like we do with any other chronic condition. So I think we need to be fair and not come at it from a stigmatic and biased perspective.
So, John and Renee, super nuanced conversation. Again, really appreciate it. What I'm hearing then is the issue is not so much, these medications are bad for muscle, but rather, potentially major weight loss without a muscle preserving plan, or at least some strategies there, may not be optimal. And the question I want to ask, is this particularly relevant for older adults, or just in general, how does the aging process affect what we've been talking about here?
Well, one of the things that, and I'll kick it to Renee in a minute, but one of the things is you look back at many of the large efficacy trials, the phase 2s, the phase 3s, older adults have been relatively underrepresented in many of those trials. And so, we have a little bit of a signal of what's going on, but not a great signal. The other part about many of those trials is that, as you all know, many of the eligibility and ineligibility criteria are a bit leaning towards the healthier person who we know, we're going to minimize side effects, we're going to minimize, adverse events and things. So we really don't know the answer to, older adults who might have some compromised medical concerns, a person with osteopenia or maybe osteoporosis, the aging effects. So, and I think, this is where I think physical activity and exercise become even more important for individuals, but not again necessarily from a fact that we're going to completely blunt the loss of lean tissue and so on, but more that we're going to, make the tissue that we have available to us, we're going to attenuate the loss as much as we can, and we're going to make the tissue we have that we do have much at a higher quality and more functional, right? And I think that even if you took an older adult who would not be prescribed a medication, I think the guidelines and everybody agrees that's what we should be recommending to that individual, and that's exactly what we should be be doing. And so I think that we've got to be a little bit, I don't want to say concerned, but we got to be paying attention to it. And this is where good management, right, comes in terms of how are we caring for patients? Do we have them to the right individuals? Do we have them to the right exercise professionals? You know, Stu and Marty, you both indicated earlier, it's not like you just throw somebody in the gym and say, go after it. I think Renee can speak to the fact that, you know, what we're seeing in our study is that individuals, as they're losing significant amount of weight, all of a sudden, you know, every few weeks we're having to readjust their seat positions on different exercises because now they're I mean, these are things that the general person's not going to know, right? And that's where some problems can come in. If you have the wrong angles, you have the wrong, you know, you're not set up the right way. All of a sudden you have knee pain. Well, let's adjust you, and now the knee pain's going to, you know, subside. So I think there's a lot of nuances here that we're not even thinking about, but we're seeing it, and so we're paying attention to it at this point.
John, you know, you mentioned nuances. I'm so glad you mentioned that one. You know, changing seat position, you all know, then we're doing a leg press, right? And all of a sudden we move that seat in by 2 notches. What happens to your volume? You know, all those unique things. And that person then is like, what happened? I was doing so good. You just had to drop my weight. I can't even push this, right? Everything changes. The angles change. We have underfueling issues too. You know, we have folks that are not eating, you know, you'll ask them when their last meal was, and they're like, oh, last night. It's 1 o'clock in the afternoon and they haven't had a snack, hydration issues. So this wraparound care is so important. But yeah, I just wanted to sneak those 2 little nuances that you mentioned in there, John, why the qualified exercise professional, we will shoot it to the rooftops, right, is always so important in this relationship. But, you know, I think that my campaign, and if people have seen me on social media, has been, we need to start saying muscle health. I think we want to get away from it all being all about composition, because John just described that, right? And you know, these composition changes, I think we're going to be disappointed for the most part. And I really think preservation is the wrong term at the end of the day, because when we gain weight, when we gain adipose tissue, typically an individual is going to gain lean tissue to support the frame. So there's going to be an increase up. That's the way it goes, physiology. And then that adaptation, when you start to lose adipose tissue, is that lean tissue that you likely had gained is going to come down. So we're going to expect some to come down. So the idea of total preservation kind of physiologically doesn't add up. No, we're talking specifically lean tissue, right? Interesting though, when we talk about sarcopenic obesity, that relationship's a little different, because now we've already got someone that is at a lower level of tissue, muscle tissue potentially going in. And we see that same gain, lose. That gets somewhat distorted. So I think, Marty, to your question, that's where a little bit of this is interesting, because we haven't also done a great job with that relationship that I just described and really quantifying that well, and what to expect in a lean tissue gain with gain and what to expect in a lean tissue loss with loss overall across like decades of doing this. Now we're in GLP-1 and we're trying to understand this, and it's not really working. And we're all talking about sarcopenic obesity and the concern about that. And I do think with older adults, we might need to consider that, right? We might need to look at that relationship. So I think this is where on the front end, we need to do a better job of assessing the individual, not just from a body composition standpoint, which there's a huge push in the clinic now to do that, which I am not against. I only think that's 50% of what we need to be assessing, though. Functional measures really should be mattering, especially when we're looking at an older adult, because again, going back to that qualitative data, if someone's feeling fatigued, if someone's feeling weaker, and they're telling us on the front end before we've even entered a weight loss state or a weight loss trajectory or whether it's therapy or anything else, we should really be understanding that when we start talking to a patient about strategies, when to introduce strategies, and how to create wraparound care.
John, you said I'm clearly getting worked up about this, and I think we all seen Marty get worked. Who am I kidding? It's me who gets worked up. I mean, you get worked up because you care, right? And it's the passion about obviously the topic, the people, and just they're not widgets, right? They don't just come in the gym and you go, okay, ACSM guidelines or motor pack guidelines, here we go. And it's like, what do you mean you can't do this? And as you said, Renee, I have a friend who reported to me, started taking the medication and said, I'm so tired. I said, what did you eat yesterday? And he listed it out. I said, that's about 700 calories. I said, no wonder you're under fueling. John, Renee, I just want to dig a little deeper on this point. And I think, we've known for a long time, we've had bariatric surgery around for 4 decades, longer now, that when you lose weight, some of the weight that you're going to lose is going to be lean tissue. Some is going to be muscle mass.
I think that you're right, Stu, that we've seen this across all modalities of obesity care, where we've seen weight loss, where we've seen some of this, what we'll call an adaptive response. If you take a look at an individual who is at a lower body weight, they actually have less muscle mass than an individual who is at a much higher body weight. The major difference between those two individuals is the functional health of that tissue most of the time. And so this is likely an adaptation, just like when we add weight training, for example, we're trying to build up the tissue. Well, when we stop that training and we reduce the weight, we tend to adapt and come down. So at a low, you need less lean tissue and muscle tissue to sustain a lower body weight than you do at a higher body weight. So if we think about the body weight itself being resistance, this is likely, some of it is likely a natural adaptation to simply being at a lower body weight. And I think that whether that tissue then becomes dysfunctional is a whole different question. But the natural adaptation is probably correct.
Unloading, when we lose some weight, we unload the body. And as we unload the body, as John's saying, you also don't need as much lean tissue to support your frame. So that's important, because you can do the same activities and maybe you don't need as much different tissues to help you. And that's general function, right? But there is a line with everything. So we don't need to scare everybody. Some tissue loss is going to be expected. But when we start to see a functional deficit, that's when we need to maybe focus in more on specializing, doing more exercise, doing more functional training. That's where, resistance, fatigue, all those kinds of things come in. But the reality is we can expect, and we see this in the clinical trial data, even without progressive overload exercise, patients, as they lose weight, they still function better, even though they've lost some lean tissue. That's just the reality of unloading the body. So again, there's the edge of glory with everything, and we need to make sure certain populations may be at higher risk. But at the end of the day, we shouldn't scare people that all of this tissue changes are the kinds of things that this is why GLP-1s or this class of medications are bad. The reality is they could be making the human being more functional, and that's the launching point for maybe doing even more movement.
Again, so much to unpack, and I really do appreciate both of your takes on this, because it adds a level of it's all inside baseball, but I'll call it inside GLP-1 talk and chatter. So thank you both very much. We do have listener questions, and I think this one's a pretty good one. Does muscle loss while taking, or lean mass loss, GLP-1s affect men and women differently? And part 2, and if so, what should they know? And what about menopause? So that was ABC, and I know it's a lot to unpack.
Well, I don't think we absolutely 100% know the answer. In particular, I don't think we know the answer when it comes to obesity management medications like the GLP-1s. One of the things that we are actually studying in our study is we are going to be looking at the sex differences, men to women. We actually are going to be monitoring menopausal status and seeing what's the difference when you have women who have gone through the menopause or premenopause, perimenopause. So we have a lot of questions here. What's one of the things that's interesting, at least from the early data from many of these medications, was that unlike lifestyle interventions where you had diet, exercise, men tended to have greater effectiveness for those medications on loss of body weight, but the attenuation of lean tissue. Women are tending to do just as well, if not better, in terms of weight loss with these medications compared to men. And so the body composition differences are going to be extremely, extremely interesting to take a look at in these individuals. But I don't think we have a clear signal at this point in time, anything about that. And that's one of the beauties of what we're looking at in our trial.
Nothing to add there other than to say, finally, like women, this is great, right? We're finally seeing a leveling of the playing field when it comes to a weight loss strategy, that may be helpful. And the menopausal status and it is so interesting, and the effects on body composition. I think bone also is something that we're going to be measuring in the trial that really interested in that as well and understanding that a little more.
If I can just ask, and you've educated us or reminded us of a lot of really important points here, and again, just how nuanced this issue is. But I think for a lot of listeners, what should they be doing if they want to minimize loss of muscle mass while taking these medications, and appreciating that, as you pointed out, some of that is to be expected, and that's just physiology if you have significant weight loss. But how to sort of minimize, I won't use the word preserve, what should people be doing?
Well, I won't get into it because I'll say something wrong and then Stu will pick on me. But I think, adequately fueling with the adequate amount of protein in your body is probably an important piece of this whole puzzle. And I'll let Stu rant about that. But I think across the board, I mean, we've known for decades now that muscle health, lean tissue is important, and that exercise, physical activity is one of the most important things a person can do. And, I mentioned this earlier in the podcast. I think, anytime you put resistance on the body, that can be carrying your own body weight, that can be getting out of a chair, that can be putting resistance on a bicycle while you're pedaling it, is resistance to me. And it's putting resistance and stress, good stress on the body. And I think that, let's help people to encourage movement for all. And as they start to develop a lifestyle of physical activity and a liking and a love for physical activity, let's progress them up. And I don't want Renee says one size fits none. So when it comes to activity, one size doesn't fit everybody. If they want to go for a walk, go for a walk. If they want to ride a bike, ride a bike. If they want to take a yoga class, take it. It's this journey of becoming, of developing an activity, a lifestyle of physical activity. And so I think that's the starting place, as opposed to saying we have the perfect exercise program for you. And if I hear one more time on social media that somebody has a GLP-1 exercise program, I'm gonna be sick. Because I don't know what that is. I honestly don't know what that is. And guess what? They don't know what it is either, other than they're trying to sell something.
It's so funny because John said, did you hear him take my tagline, by the way, in that? Yeah, no, just teasing. You're allowed. I learned everything I learned from you. I'll let you have it once. But it is so true. We talked a lot about person-centered programming, but really it's out there. What we're seeing is method-centered programming. We're taking a method, or we're pinning a method against each other. And it's not helping anyone, because person-centered programs so much more than that. And I think that that's where we want to go. And I like to say this, and when I even speak to patients, I like to do a lot of patient advocacy work in this space as well, is John nailed it in saying, step one is developing a healthy relationship with activity. For all of the other reasons, whether a person's had experiences with pain, whether they've had a negative experience in the gym related to weight bias and stigma, or they just have internalized feelings about themselves, their body, and their space, we need to help them recognize what's the opportunity is ahead and work with them with compassion. Because if we can get that physiological positive signal, have them feeling and functioning better as a starting point, then we can progress them. But if we never get past that starting point, we can talk about progressive strategies all day long, overload principles of specificity, everything that we know in this world, but the door is shut because we've never been able to get them through that first point where the opportunity for true health and well-being happens. So my terms, as I said, let's get away from this versus that. Let's focus on the person. Let's make it about, really helping them feel and function their best. And let's talk about health, muscle health, feeling your best every day.
I'd love to come up with something trite to say to cap that off, but I think you've done everything we asked you to do, and definitely hard facts, no hype, definitely fit that prescription. I just want to, thank you both for taking the time. I know you're busy people. We've got you up early in the morning to do this, and getting the good word out there. As you say, develop healthy relationships with food, with physical activity, with exercise, and a little bit of live and let live as well around what is it that makes you excited to move. And I couldn't agree more. So I want to thank you both very much for joining us on the Real Exercise Science podcast. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in this week.
Exercise Science is produced by Ghost Bureau, Chris Shulgin, with support from Chantel Gurdon, Andrew Imex, and Darren Chada.
Remember, we're on most platforms at Real Exercise Science. Give us a follow or a subscribe. And if you enjoyed this episode, please by all means share the podcast with someone in your life who wants to know more about exercise science.
We'll see you next week.
The Exercise Science Podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only and is not a substitute for professional medical advice. Strength training and fitness carry inherent risks. Always consult with a physician before starting any new exercise program or making changes to your diet. The hosts, producers, sponsors, and guests of this podcast disclaim any liability for any injuries or losses connected with the information discussed in this show. The science of strength and fitness is continually evolving. While we strive to provide accurate, evidence-based information, we make no representations or warranties regarding the completeness, accuracy, or timeliness of the information discussed.